big language coming directly from the White House on a very explosive conflict, potentially.
Yeah, I mean, at some point we have to start asking ourselves, is this just the way that Donald Trump speaks? And he speaks in superlatives. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're taking or considering taking some kind of massive action militarily against North Korea. I mean, it's such a fascinating interview alongside an interview in the Washington Post about NAFTA, where we could see the president's learning curve in real time on North Korea, because also in that interview, he talked about the fact that he had been approached on a call about Taiwan from the Taiwanese president, but because he has this very good relationship with President Xi, he'd like to consult Beijing first. This is the president realizing the limits of what he can do and how much he needs other countries to try and get things done. And on North Korea, that's example number one, right? He realizes now he needs the Chinese, so he can't do anything that would possibly alienate them at the moment.
You know, this is one of those moments in this presidency where it's very concerning. You got a president of the United States, Harold, you've been in Washington, you served in the House of Representatives. When you have a president of the United States really turning up the Bunsen burner in a situation, saying there's a chance here that we're going to have a major conflict with North Korea. Absolutely. That's the President of the United States speaking. Words have meaning. And I don't know, I just feel uncomfortable that a president would be saying this in a situation so fraught with danger.
You almost hope that he would have taken the same position he took after the test of that missile went awry. And there was some suggestion that maybe America had a role in it, but he didn't tweet, he didn't say a word. Two, it's encouraging, slightly encouraging to hear Tillerson align ourselves with China and say that our goal is denuclearization. And three, the thing that worries me most, this guy is irrational, and I guess he's probably been
Trump or
Kim Jong-un is irrational, and for the president to take the position that he's not rational or is rational, I think to Caddy, what Caddy's saying, we almost have to get used to the way he talks, and you can't invest totally in thinking that he's on the up and up when he talks.
The problem with that, though, Donnie, is, and I think when Caddy said that, we all nodded a little bit. This is the way Donald Trump speaks in superlatives, but now he's the president of the United States, and North Korea is watching and listening. And so when he says that, they believe that's the posture of the United States government. Someone like Kim Jong-un does.
But, well, interestingly enough, I'm going to actually defend Trump, which I rarely do, and kind of pick up what Caddy was saying. Whether it is a country, whether it is an individual, whether it is a corporation, whether it is Congress, we are learning. Yes, he is president, and he should not speak in those grandiose terms, but we are learning to decipher. So if it was 99 days ago, and he said that, we would all be going into our bomb shelters and whatnot. Basically, what he was simply saying is, yeah, there could be a conflict, and of course there could be a conflict. We all know that. There's either this patience, and somehow works itself out, or there'll be a conflict. So, like it or not, he does speak it that way. Our job as both citizens and, more importantly, as the rest of the world, is to just kind of translate to what that means, and we're learning to do that.
And Lonnie, what followed from that statement about a major comment was Trump did say, but we prefer diplomacy. He talks about the efforts of the Chinese, how impressed he's been with President Xi since they had their meeting at Mar-a-Lago, et cetera, et cetera. But the pull-out quote, the jump-out headline this morning is major conflict, and North Korea is listening to that.
Yeah, you know, Willie, the thing is, we're used to talking about foreign policy in very moderated terms. If you think about the last several administrations, this point that words matter, they do matter in the sense that administrations have conveyed foreign policy through nuance. That's not how this president works. You know, what President Trump was expressing is not a significant deviation from U.S. policy with respect to North Korea. We've always maintained that a military option would be on the table. What is unusual, of course, is the tone and the tenor he's taken in discussing the potential for that military action. So I think it's important for us to separate out the tone from the policy. Now, admittedly, that may be difficult with this administration, but let's just recognize here, not a huge change in U.S. policy, but a huge change in the way we talk about it.
Meanwhile, in that same interview with Reuters, the president addressed the cost of American military protection for its ally South Korea, which was a frequent topic during his campaign. He said Seoul should pay for a U.S. anti-missile system that he priced at $1 billion, and he insisted on changes to a 2011 U.S.-Korea trade agreement.
It's unacceptable. It's a horrible deal made by Hillary. It's a horrible deal, and we're going to renegotiate that deal or terminate it.
When are you going to announce that?
Very soon. I'm announcing it now.
The president's comments sent stocks tumbling in South Korean financial markets, which had improved with an increased demand in cars and electronics. As for divisions in his White House on issues like free trade, the president told the Wall Street Journal last night, quote, "Hey, I'm a nationalist and a globalist. I'm both. And I'm the only one who makes the decision, believe me." Kathy, let's go back to North Korea, talking about defense there and also the trade deal that exists between the United States and South Korea. What are the implications of the President of the United States saying that, especially against the backdrop of this potential conflict with North Korea?
Look, I mean, at the moment, the United States needs China, but it also needs to make sure that it doesn't alienate its allies in South Korea, which is going through a very difficult political transition of its own at the moment. And this is the kind of thing, I think, where the president saying, I'm announcing now that I'm renegotiating an important American trade deal, a little bit in the way that he said, or floated, the White House floated the idea that it was thinking of pulling out of NAFTA a couple of days ago. These things can have material consequences, as we found out over NAFTA when the Mexican peso and the Canadian dollar both fell. So the president has to be careful not to be rash in the way that he announces things. I mean, it is this kind of weird, slightly off the cuff, okay, here we go, I'm going to announce a policy right now in an interview, in a way that didn't seem planned or thought through necessarily, or the economic implications of that thought through. And that has consequences for America's allies.
Look, to Kathy's point, and I don't necessarily disagree with Don Ayre. I wasn't trying to be too critical of him, but we'll say this. He did recognize in the first part of his comments that North Korea is a family business. And if we've ever had a president that understands a family business, President Trump represents that. To Lonnie's point, this president finally has a cabinet around him and leaders around him that people respect. So you have Tillerson in the paper this morning over the last day or two saying, look, we don't want regime change in North Korea, which is a positive in many ways. The thing most confusing about the last part of what Willie said, that quoting the president, I would take it to Lonnie and get his reaction on this, is the president invoked South Korea. The one thing the Chinese want is, when they talk about denuclearization of the peninsula and other aspirations and goals, is they want us out of South Korea. I mean, when you think about President Trump, he thinks in terms of tweets. The president of China thinks in terms of centuries. So as you think about South Korea and that last comment, how do you put that in the context of your answer to what we ought to be thinking about with Trump in terms of nuances in his language?
Well, I think that's an excellent point you make, that the Chinese view is the long view. There's no question about it. The interesting thing about the Xi-Trump relationship is how much that's evolved already in the course of the first 100 days of Trump's presidency. I mean, you went from a campaign where the president was talking about how China was taking the U.S. to the cleaners now to a situation where you have the two leaders very much looking at a relationship based on pragmatism. And that's really what I'm watching for now. As these two leaders develop their relationship going forward, really we're not just talking about the relationship between Trump and Xi. We're talking about the relationship between the two most significant powers on the global stage today. So that is certainly a big factor here. South Korea is a factor in that as well, clearly, because one of the big issues you look at when you look at the Asia Pacific are the economic issues. And really, trade is first and foremost. The U.S. pulling out of TPP now, the U.S.-Korea deal becomes that much more important to the Koreans. You can understand why they're concerned.
I want to pick up on that word nuance, and something that I'm seeing that it feels very relieving. When I listen to that interview about Korea, there are two things. Notice very often when he's speaking now, he's speaking in much more hushed tones. I know it's a nuance, but there's not the volume to the voice. And the words themselves, even the way he describes the North Korean leader is, you know, I'm not saying this, I'm not saying this, as you're, you know, kind of presenting facts. There seems to be a much more nuanced, rational, restrained. Yes, there's still the political Tourette's, and we still get some of these ridiculous things. But if you really step back and just landed from Mars in the last 2 weeks, and you were listening to this president, both in tone and content, you would say, you know, maybe there's a little bit more normalcy going on there. Than
that was an Oval Office interview, so you might expect that tone. Right. Tomorrow he's got a rally in Pennsylvania where you'll probably see Donald Trump from the campaign.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.